Did you know that this, and also this actually isn't Chinese? At least that's what the people on TikTok are saying. So if you spend any amount of time on TikTok, and especially when it's focused on China or Chinese people or Chinese creators, you've probably already heard about the conversation about Chinese things being rebranded as other nations' things, especially Japanese and Korean. A very big thing was the Douyin makeup. When that became trendy, people were rebranding it as Japanese makeup or Korean makeup.
One kiss is all it takes.
The same thing has happened with the brand Flower Nose. People assume that it's Japanese because it looks cute, so it must be Japanese. The famous northern Chinese snack糖葫芦, which is traditionally supposed to be hawthorn covered in sugar, and today you cover all kinds of fruit with it. But all of these things have been rebranded a little bit, or at least people are saying that it's not Chinese, and then people are having to correct people. And I think the wildest thing is, it's even gone as far as people posting, "This is why Korea is great." And they're posting pictures of Chinese women with their literal Xiaohongshu ID name in the picture. It's so crazy.
I've seen that a lot. I think we're at the point that the West consider South Korean stuff and Japanese stuff fancy.
Yeah.
And they think China is not a fancy place. So they rebrand a lot of Chinese stuff.
And I've heard this conversation be especially about the beautiful woman thing. That if a Chinese woman in the West is good looking, people automatically assume that she must be Korean or Japanese. Because, wait, you're Chinese? Then why do you look good? Like, there's an inherent amount of xenophobia in all of this.
So I guess a lot of people ask, why does it even matter? It's just candy fruit and some pictures on social media.
But when it comes to this specific thing, especially in the context of it being Chinese, there's a long-standing history of Chinese things being rebranded as belonging to other nation, or that the origin dating back to China just being completely wiped. So to give a few examples of this, and I actually didn't even know these things, and I would say I probably know more about Chinese culture than the average Westerner at least. Bonsai. My whole life has been branded as Japanese, like those little tiny trees.
Bonsai referring to penzai, which is already a wrong name for that art. Is penjing. I think every Chinese know what that is. And everyone would be surprised that was rebranded as Japanese.
And the same thing for tea. So for those that don't know the history of tea, Britain was trading with China. And tea was a very valuable thing to trade with, and it only was being grown in China. It was like a state secret. So because Britain didn't want to pay China for this, they went in, sent in a spy who stole the plant, and then they planted it in their colony on Ceylon, what is today Sri Lanka, and grew tea there. And now most people, I guess, don't even know that tea comes from China. I asked my mother, and she was like, "Oh, it comes from the East." But she got really shocked when she heard that it was a traditionally just Chinese thing that was then spread out.
Actually, Chinese people would be very surprised that people don't know.
And what's even worse is today, because of British influence in tea, we all think of Britain and tea as one. There's a weird appropriation that has happened with what tea looks like in the West because of Britain, that we all think of tea as this powdered, like tiny crumbs, when that's not what tea is originally. And then we just talked about another thing that you said, that China, like porcelain, originated from China, and I collect porcelain, but I didn't know this.
I mean, the name China.
Yeah, but I thought that's just because you guys were able to make a specific type of it. The final thing that also surprised me was that I have seen people accuse Chinese people of stealing cherry blossoms from Japan. That some like Japan fans will go after Chinese people and be like, "Oh, they're just copying, they want to be like Japan." Funny enough, turns out cherry blossoms actually come from Tibet.
Yeah, and it was planted all around the country very early. Like let's say Sui Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, Wei Jin. It was already well planted.
So of course today it is a staple thing in Japan. It is a thing synonymous with their culture as well. But instead of accusing China of stealing something, there should be an understanding that this is a shared culture, and yes, Japan has made it its own thing in the way they incorporate it.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't think that this is Japanese influence on China, because it diminishes what Chinese culture also is, and you're actually doing something called cultural erasure, where you delete the fact that it is a factor and try to attribute it to something completely separate.
Yeah.
And another area where this happens a lot is in Hanfu. So Hanfu is Han Chinese clothes during the Han Chinese dynasties and the Yuan dynasty as well. So when pictures are posted of Hanfu, a lot of people will say that, oh, China just copies hanbok, or China just copies kimono because they look similar. The reason why they look similar is because the traditional clothes that Japan and Korea has today came from China originally, and of course, Korea and Japan both adapted it to their lifestyle, but that's why they'll always look a little bit similar, because they have a natural historical tie with each other.
I think it's because Westerners know kimono and hanbok first.
Yeah.
So they assume that's the origin of the culture, which is not. Like kimono it's called wufu. It's from the Wu area, this region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem with this not being known, because I would say the average Chinese, like a generation ago, did not know a lot about Hanfu.
No, it was a very new movement. I would say a decade ago. I started knowing Hanfu a decade ago.
But then you have big Western companies like Dior that suddenly come out with a skirt that's clearly a Mami and Chun. Like literally when you saw the pattern they had used, that was just an ancient pattern that has existed in China since, I guess, Mami and Chun is actually older than Ming Dynasty. But you see that they claim that this is an original design and weren't even willing to apologize or credit China.
I think that's extremely arrogant.
Yeah.
Like, they don't respond, even though a lot of people here or abroad criticize what they did.
Yeah.
They just ignore it, you know?
Yeah, because it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And in this, I know that in the West, calling things cultural appropriation has kind of become a trigger word for anything. This is the definition of cultural appropriation, where you take something from a culture, you change what it's known as, you remove its cultural meaning, and then you monetize it, where the original group of people that it belongs to does not benefit.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we should all shame Dior for doing this, because that's definitely not okay. And I think, unfortunately, when we talk about the erasure of Chinese influence, it is led primarily by Western countries. When I lived in Japan, my experience is that Japanese people fully acknowledge that kimono has an origin somewhere. Kanji comes from China originally, that is Hanzi.
Yeah.
But online, sometimes you see characters and people are like, doesn't this come from Japan? And it's so deranged, because if you take classes, like if you went to school in Japan, you would be taught traditional Chinese literature, because it's tied together. It's a part of your cultural heritage. In many ways, I think it's very accurate to say that China is what ancient Rome is for Europeans. That there's an enormous cultural influence that we can't run away from, and it brought a lot of things with it.
Yeah.
So when you talk about East Asian culture, knowing at least something about China is important to understand context of everything. I think the most recent thing that I saw that you got very, like, a good chuckle out of. So if people have been watching our videos, they might have noticed that I use hairpins quite often.
Yeah.
Because I love hairpins. Recently, they have made like a surgence onto TikTok, Western TikTok. And people using them, and then people in the comments being like, oh, you should take a look at Korean hair sticks, because they're so beautiful. And at first I was like, huh? Like, so I tried to look up what these people are talking about, and that's just a Chinese hairpin. Like, it's the same thing. Yes, hairpins have existed for many, many years. They exist in different countries, but Korea's cultural influence does come from China, and the hairpins, specifically these, actually have a lot of Chinese symbolism on them.
Yeah.
So trying to say that they are Korean comes across very xenophobic, unfortunately. And I don't think people always intend to. It's just because, again, Korean influence is big. Like, because of Korean historical dramas, people have seen hanbok, hairpins, in that context first. So they don't realize how common hairpins is here. If you go outside to any touristy area, you'll see so many of them.
And also, I think part of why some countries try to erase the China influence is because those behaviors are encouraged in the West. If some country made up something that, it's from my culture, not Chinese culture, then Westerners would buy it.
Yeah, because there's already a negative image or connotation when you talk about China due to things like the Red Scare, the anti-Chinese propaganda that was very big during the Opium Wars, very big during the World Wars.
Yeah.
It is a continuous thing, and I think people today think that it's a new thing that we are anti-China. Actually, if you're American, this is a fundamental part of your country being anti-China.
In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law that restricted immigration based explicitly on nationality.
It has nothing to do with the current government.
No.
No matter which government this country had chosen, this would still exist.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, which sucks because it makes people miss out on a lot of wonderful things about this culture. China is the oldest written history in the world. It is wildly documented. And the influence it has had and the depth of this culture is very vast and is something you can see represented. And again, for you, like if you are interested in Japanese or Korean culture, I think that's awesome. Like being interested in other people's culture and other areas of the world is great. And there's no shame in that. But if you want to really understand the culture, you also have to understand where it comes from. Just like if you studied old European history, at some point you would also have to understand Roman influence.
Yeah.
It's a baseline to understand anything. So I think some people will ask themselves, how is this even possible? China is so big. China is a huge economy. So how can this even happen?
Partially it's because Japan and Korea, those two East Asian countries, have huge soft power in the West and huge influence in the West. China doesn't.
Yeah, China didn't focus its energy on soft power the same way.
Or you can see China couldn't.
Yeah.
Because you're a major rival to the leader of the West, America.
I think it's very important to look at who the allies of each country. So it's no secret that China is not an ally of America. They could never be. It wouldn't make any sense for two massive countries to ever be allies. But Japan, because it got occupied after the war because they lost, became a natural forced ally of America. Korea became an ally of America after the Korean War. So these countries suddenly also had access to the world's biggest soft power because it's a built-in thing in America. Hollywood is literally just a soft power machine. And it's very clever. I'll give America that. So suddenly you see that Japan starts to send out stuff like manga, anime. Its culture gets discussed way more, like geisha, samurai, ninja. Even though some of those things aren't as big in reality as it's made out to be, suddenly Westerners know about traditional art forms in Japan. And in Korea you have the dramas, you have K-pop that has really been pushed to the last, I would say, decade, probably a bit more, 15 years maybe.
Yeah.
It has really been pushed also throughout Asia. They have a huge cultural influence here as well in pop culture. So it's very easy to then forget that some of these cultural elements would also exist elsewhere.
Yeah. And also, I think the main reason is economic development.
Yeah.
For example, in the 80s and 90s, you can see Hong Kong had the biggest cultural influence in this region. You don't hear about South Korea back then. Japanese cultural influence came because of their economic achievement. And then later, you see South Korea has bigger influence because of their economic growth. Then finally, they have the capital, the social development to support this type of soft power. And China just got rich very recent. So
and I also think there's just a fundamental difference on what the governments focus on. Like the Korean government focused a lot on K-pop. They invested heavily into pushing this narrative, sending BTS into important political meetings. Where in China, the policy is very, very different because it's more internally focused constantly. Chinese politicians focus very little on what's outside the Chinese borders. Because you're also ruling a much, much bigger economy. You have to control a far bigger population. And again, Chinese development is unimaginably fast. You can feel the tempo, like me moving here. I can feel that the tempo is so high. I think people that have visited China, even if you come back a year later, the change is something you can sense, which also produces an enormous pressure for politicians. So they don't necessarily worry about what Angela Baby is up to most of the time, or what, like, I don't know, Jackson Wang is doing this week. So it's just a difference in political style.
Also, the market is big enough, so they don't focus on the foreign market.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they can just dig out a lot more gold at home.
Yeah. The Chinese consumer market is crazy. I don't think it's something to underestimate because, again, being famous in China is a gold mine in and of itself.
Yeah.
It would be like the equivalent to the European market, but in one country. So it's just something to take into consideration when you see things that are Asian and it says that it's Chinese. Maybe instead of attacking it right away and saying that Chinese people are stealing and spreading this actually very xenophobic stereotype, maybe do a little bit of digging into the history behind things, because a lot of things, one, are shared, but also, again, this is a mother culture in its own region, so it's very likely that it's either a shared thing or that it actually originated here. But yeah, I hope that you guys find this video a little bit interesting and that you'll consider following us or coming back for a future video. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.